Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. When vendors change their banking, in addition to fraud, you also have to wonder what the reason for the change is. The reason many times may be discovered only if you require the W-9 be submitted for changes to vendor banking. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 301, Vendor Banking Change, Collect a W-9 too. Now, I do want to mention there are two podcasts that I recently did on company branded vendor forms that you need. I did one was part one, and it was called the Vendor Setup Form with a Twist. And that was episode 295. It was released June 27th. And then on July 4th of all dates, I didn't record it on July 4th, so don't feel too bad for me. But on July 4th, because it was a Thursday, I released episode 296. And this was part two of that company branded vendor forms you need. And it was the vendor banking form. So I know I'm talking about vendor banking today. And I'm talking about collecting the W-9 too. Go ahead and listen to those podcasts because the vendor setup form is technically a substitute W-9. And so I talk about why it's better to use that. And then with the vendor banking form, I talk about what information you need on the vendor banking form. So that will does relate to this podcast episode, and it will help to avoid fraud while you're collecting that banking information. So again, check out episode 295 and also episode 296. All right, so you have a vendor and your vendor changed your banking. So they are submitting a bank change, and we're going to assume for this episode that it is not fraudulent, even though you do need to make sure you have authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and vendor validations in place. Another thing that I talk about in episode 296. But we're going to assume that this vendor request to change your banking is valid. But talk about something that maybe the vendor doesn't even think about or doesn't even know that you need. And that's the reason for the vendor banking change, like what triggered it on their side. And there are two things that you can uncover just by asking for the W-9. And keep in mind, the vendors, they're not thinking about what you need or why you may need something. They may not even know, right? And so what they know is that they want to get paid. And if they are a ACH or wire payment vendor, then if they did change their banking, right, they have got to give you those numbers. So they want to get paid. So they're going to give you the updated banking. But here are two things they might not tell you happened because they don't know that you need to know. The first one is that they changed banking because of an address change, because they moved. And so you do need to make sure that you have the correct address on file for them. And many banking ownership validation services can validate the address too, because that's part of what they validate when they check bank account ownership. And so when you're checking that, you want to make sure you're not putting in the old address. You want to make sure you put in the new address. So that's one for the bank account ownership validation. Two, in your accounting system or ERP, if they moved, even if they do not have a check payment method, right? So you're not sending checks to an old address. Even if that's not the case, you still need a remittance address or an address on file. You need to verify that the address on file is valid, because you're not just sending them checks. You also have to send out 1099s, and you want to make sure those are going to be delivered to the right address. And so you do need to make sure that you always have the updated and correct address on file. And again, the vendor may not know that you need that. And so when you submit or have them submit a W-9, that should give you a new address for the vendor that you can replace their old address with. All right, so that was the first one because of address change. And then the second one is the result or because of a tax ID or name change. So that could be the result of a merger or an acquisition, or they just wanted to change their legal name. And you're not going to find that out. Actually, you might find that out depending on what information you require. They submit for the banking change, right? Because they usually submit the bank name, but you wouldn't find it out if they only changed your tax ID. But if they change your tax ID or they change their name, now you've got some real things that you need to do in the vendor master file. So maybe this should really be three things, but the changing of the tax ID and the name change can be the result of a merger or acquisition, or they just wanted to make those changes for whatever business reason. So if they do, now you've got things again to do in the vendor master file. So if they change your name, let's start with that. If they change your name, again, you might find that be on the vendor banking form or whatever you collect. I do recommend it be the vendor banking form. Check out episode 296. But they may indicate that on whatever you require for a bank change, banking on letterhead, maybe a voided check. And so you may find that, but you also have other things that you need to do in your accounting system or ERP, like you need to go in and make sure that you update the vendor legal name. Now, when I have a request for the vendor legal name, right, you need to make sure you're requesting the W-9 because you want to get an updated W-9 with the new legal name and the tax ID, because you want to make sure that didn't change. But for this example scenario, we're going to assume it didn't. But you still want the new W-9 with the updated legal name and tax ID combination, and you want to definitely do an IRS 10 match to make sure it is correct. Now, keep in mind, if they change their tax ID or legal name with the IRS, the IRS doesn't always update their 10 match records or database in a timely fashion. And so if you do a 10 match and it's does not come back as successful, reach out to the vendor and ask them for their letter from the IRS, or they can contact the IRS and get an EIN verification letter, and the IRS will send them what's called a 147C, and then you can use that as support to set up the vendor or to update the name without having a valid 10 match. Now, on the vendor record, if they only change your vendor name, then you only have to worry about updating the vendor name once you do the 10 match or get that letter verifying their new legal name. You can keep the same vendor record because the activity actually doesn't follow the legal name. It really follows the tax ID in your accounting system or ERP. And so you want to make sure that you just update the vendor legal name and DBA as applicable and based on that new W-9. Now, I don't know if I said it before, but the vendor legal name, you need to update that because if you do bank account ownership validation, you're going to need to put in the accurate legal name. Otherwise, it's not going to find it. All right. So let's say they had a tax ID change. So we talked about the name change. Now we're going to talk about the tax ID change. Now, both the name, legal name, and the tax ID are on the W-9. And so when you collect it, you will see whether or not the tax ID has changed. And that's something that may not be included. That tax ID may not be included on any form that they may submit to you, the voided check, the banking on letterhead, either the vendors or the banks. That's why you really need to collect a vendor banking form as well. But it's also on the W-9, and so you will catch it if you get the W-9 and look at the tax ID and see that it has changed. Now, once you do the IRS 10 match, again, remembering that the IRS 10 match records may not be, or database may not be updated, so you may have to get an EIN verification letter from the vendor. But once you do the 10 match and then it's valid, or you have a valid EIN verification letter from the vendor, then you can go ahead now and start the complex process of updating the tax ID. And I shouldn't say update because in the system, you're not really updating your vendor record. You are inactivating the vendor record with the existing or with the prior tax ID, and you're going to create a new vendor record with the new tax ID. Now, I'm going to tell you no one's going to like that, because if there are any pending invoices, pending purchase orders, pending payments, then all of those have to be moved to the new vendor. Not to mention the fact if you've got a lot of feeds that are coming in, EDI files, maybe for that vendor, all of that has to be updated too. Oh, and I just remembered, what about any e-invoicing portals or other vendor portals that they might be registered in using that either old tax ID, old legal name, and then also the old vendor ID, right? And so now all of that has to be updated. But you would have never found that out had you not asked for the W-9. So 3 things on the W-9 that may trigger additional changes outside or in addition to the vendor banking change that the vendor submitted was an address change, a change to the name, legal name, and then also a change to the tax ID, all of which have some consequences or updates in the accounting system or ERP on the vendor record, with the tax ID change being the most complex or cumbersome. Now, this question actually came to me from a subscriber, and I thought that it might be something that others would be interested in. And so if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me. I have my email address in the show notes, and you can ask any question you want. And if there is any interest that I think in the wider audience, I might use it on a future podcast. All right. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 301st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.